Okay, so in this video, I just want to take some time and go through the hormones for the female reproductive tract, because there's a lot to kind of consider with this one. You're actually timing up two different cycles, so do be aware of the fact that you have two different cycles. There's the uterine cycle, which is the one that we're more familiar with because there's an observable feature. So with menses, the endometrium is shed each month, about every 28 days. That's coordinated along with an ovarian cycle. So the ovaries have different stages of events that they're going to go through, and they do have to be synced. And so we have to have hormonal communication to make sure that these things happen at the right timing. So that way the developing follicle is ready and ovulates at the right time, to also have the uterus be ready for an embryo if it's fertilized. So let's go through how do we coordinate all of this, starting actually not even in the female reproductive tract, but up at the brain. So we'll have the hypothalamus secreting gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH, so gonadotropin releasing hormone. And if you remember, when we've talked about endocrine stuff before, releasing hormones, or all the hormones from the hypothalamus called releasing hormones, they're always going to target the anterior pituitary. Now from there, this is where it's a little different in females versus males. We're actually only going to release one of those gonadotropic hormones at a time. The first one that we're going to release is going to be follicular stimulating hormone, so FSH, and that's going to go over to the uterus. So we do this one first. There's two hormones from anterior pituitary that are going to go down, talk to the ovary, but the second one's not going to get released yet. It is getting produced at this time. This does stimulate its production, but not its release. So follicle stimulating hormone. With a name like follicle stimulating hormone, guess what it's stimulating? Yeah, the follicles. So let's draw an ovary real quick. It's not gonna be pretty, but there's our ovary. And so we're gonna go in here, we're gonna stimulate the follicles. I'm gonna draw a little circle. They're not that big. So follicular development. That's your main thing. So FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, stimulating the follicles. Follicles are going to develop. We're going to go through that process of going from a primordial follicle to a primary, to a secondary, to an antral, to a mature. So they're doing cell division. The cells are going to get bigger. The meiosis 1 process is going to finish up so that primary oocyte can become a secondary oocyte. So it can get ready for ovulation. So we have that follicular development happening. Now, as you're making more and more of these cells, you're secreting more and more estrogen, because all these cells out here, so I guess follicle, we're going to draw a bunch of things. So a bunch of those cells, here's that oocyte in there somewhere. Those cells are secreting estrogen. Now, initially, we're talking a little tiny primordial follicle, so maybe something tiny like this one, right? And we had simple squamous around it. It's not going to be making as much as like something big like this. But hopefully you get the size difference. So initially, you're not going to be making very much estrogen because it's coming from these follicular cells. And so you're actually going to have low levels of estrogen coming from that follicle and actually serving as a negative feedback loop, saying, hey, not ready to ovulate yet. I'm still kind of tiny. I got a lot of more division to go. As you get bigger and you create more and more cells, you're going to secrete more and more estrogen. And so that signal goes from being a negative signal to a positive signal to say, yeah, I've made enough, and so now we're going to be a positive feedback. And so estrogen is going to communicate back up towards that brain, initially in the first 10 days saying, yeah, just not enough cells here yet, we're still growing, we have stuff to do before we can ovulate. After about day 10, now we're saying, yeah, we're ready now. And so if we're ready now, you can now release the hormone to tell us it's time to ovulate. And that's where the timing component comes in. So this is estrogen. I probably should write that down real quick. And estrogen can do a couple of things. So one, communicating back up to the brain. Estrogen also can, let's do a different color. So let's do this one. Ooh. Estrogen can also communicate to the uterus. To uterus. And so you're getting, first at the low levels, menstruation, or menses. That's where the inner lining, the endometrium, is being shed. And then as the levels of estrogen build up, you're going to say, okay, we're going to build up the wall because we're getting ready to ovulate. And so we're going to do the proliferative phase. The next step is when we get this signal back here to say, okay, so you're big enough now. You have a secondary oocyte. You can ovulate. And so we got to send a signal from the anterior pituitary to say, okay, it's time to release that oocyte. So now we're going to release the second one, which is our LH, luteinizing hormone. So now we get that follicle to come over to the side and release that secondary oocyte. Remember, some of the cells stay behind. And the cells that stay behind are going to be our corpus luteum. We are going to enter what we call the luteal phase of development. So follicular development is your follicular phase. Follicular phase was triggered by FSH. So FSH causes follicular phase. Follicular phase happens at the same time as menses and proliferative phase, because we're dealing with that low levels and then buildup of estrogen. The corpus luteum is going to start what we call the luteal phase. Luteal phase is triggered by the release of luteinizing hormone. The names tell you which phase you're at in the ovary. So these are the ovarian cycles. Follicular phase, luteal phase, and you're just repeating these each month. FSH causes a follicular phase. First 10 days, estrogen's inhibiting the signal of LH. Then after that, it'll say, okay, you can let LH out. When LH comes to that ovary, you're saying, all right, go ahead and ovulate. When ovulation occurs, so that's that event here, the cells that are left behind are the corpus luteum, or form the corpus luteum, and that's the start of the luteal phase. The reason why it's called a luteal phase is because this now is in charge of signaling. And so you're going to have another hormone released from these cells. So you still get estrogen, because they were doing that before. But now you're also going to add progesterone to come to the uterus. And that progesterone coming to the uterus is going to trigger what we call the secretory phase. This is the signal where you're saying, hey, I let out an egg, it could get fertilized, let's secrete a glucose-rich mucus. So you have sugars sitting right there on the wall so that the embryo, when it sticks to the wall, has something to eat and to break down so it can actually make enough ATP to keep doing all the cell division. Because there's no umbilical cord yet. You actually have to build that, so you need energy to build that. So with that secretory phase, that's going to be timed up to be during luteal phase. So luteal phase is going to have this one go with it, and then follicular phase has these two. Now, if the corpus luteum degrades because this doesn't get fertilized, it does change. So the corpus luteum, what color do I want? So this thing right here will turn into scar tissue, which is going to be the corpus albicans. That occurs if there's no fertilization, and you're going to start doing that follicular phase of development all over again. So you kind of have this one and this one happening at the same time. All right, everyone. I hope that helps make sense about the coordination between all of the events in the female reproductive system. Thanks for watching.